I'm Andy Hadfield. Tune in for my chat with Saray Khumalo. We're going to explore entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship, startup failures, South Africa, politics, social media, and a whole bunch more. Look forward to engaging with you.
Because It's There with Saray Khumalo is proudly sponsored by Vuma.
Hello, everybody. This is Saray Khumalo back with you, and wherever you are. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And this is Because It's There, a podcast that looks at leadership. You know, why be great? Why be a leader? Because in spite of everything else, our insecurities, what people say about us, where we come from, we are all leaders and we can change our world one step at a time. And today I'm talking to an amazing friend and somebody that's done amazing stuff as a leader himself about for the people, by the people, really about volunteerism, which comes down to what we all know, which is really Ubuntu. Andy, welcome to Because It's There.
Thank you so much for having me.
Amazing. So I'm going to start with an icebreaker, really a question. Share with us something that left you absolutely amazed in the last 7 days.
In the last 7 days? Oh, wow. If you said last 7 years, I could have helped you out. Last 7 days. So we got some interesting stats out of the forgood platform, which I know we're gonna talk more about. And interestingly enough, we've never really been good at disaster relief because our business model is largely about providing software and services into large corporates so that their employees can give back. And often there's just too much of a time delay between kind of getting campaigns going inside our clients and the actual disasters happening on the ground. And yet we got some stats from the recent riots that happened. And we had a look at them in the last 7 days. So I'm answering your question. And the monetary response was absolutely astonishing. In that it was more than 10 times any other week or 12-day period that we've ever done on the platform. And that was just kind of corporate employees across South Africa getting their credit cards out and just chipping into a bunch of charities that were in the middle of the chaos in KZN and Gauteng. Yeah. And that was amazing to see. Like when you have graphs that go like this, whoop, and a big skyscraper, and it's all just a result of people feeling that they need to do something. I enjoyed that.
Absolutely. I think South Africans have proven time and time and again that when there's drama, we stand up to the play and then we make things happen. And there's a unity in spite of our diversity. So absolutely love that.
And of course, we're crowdfunding for Olympic medals at the moment. So not us, but it's happening on social media. So the South Africans we're one hell of a people.
Absolutely. Love that. Let's go into your values. For Good is not only a name of the initiative that you co-founded in 2015, a social enterprise that creates and runs employee volunteering program for large corporates, but it also seems to be a recurring metaphor in your personal life. Kindly share what being for good means to you, Andy.
It's interesting that you say it's a recurring metaphor, because until the whole For Good journey started, 7 years ago, until then, I would have defined myself as purely a rampant capitalist. And now I think I define myself as a socially minded rampant capitalist. So the origin stories of kind of how I met Garth Jaffet, who was actually the original founder of For Good, and how we decided to start working together and relaunch this whole thing in 2015. It's quite a cool story. And I think it speaks to this idea of values and social enterprises, social entrepreneurship. I was kind of between roles, thinking about what to do, thinking about the next project would be. And I wrote this blog post called, you can look it up, your audience can look it up, called What Pisses Me Off About the NPO Sector. And it wasn't hating on charities. I'd watched this TED talk by a guy called Dan Pallotta I think it's called What We Think About Charity is Dead Wrong. And it was speaking about this absolute mismatch between some of the most valuable organizations on our continent, but definitely in our country. I mean, without the nonprofit sector, South Africa would have been lost many, many years ago. And the fact that because they're run outside of a capitalist system, it makes life much, much harder for them. So what I mean by that is they have no access to risk capital. They have no access to venture capital. They often have to pay below market standards. They're victims of donor politics. So donors who expect every dollar to go into the mouth of a hungry orphan and no dollars to go to the mouths of the people that actually run the organization. Yes, that situation is getting better, but it's largely still a problem. Charities have to bring out the begging bowl. They're not, necessarily allowed to, in certain cases, generate revenue. And there's tax implications when they do. And it just seems like the dice are just stacked against nonprofits. And then you add to that the fact that, why do you have to be rich to be philanthropic? Because that seems to be a theme in our world, is that you get rich and then you give it away. Why can we not create a company that makes money and helps people at the same time? Now, it sounds awfully cliched, but that was kind of the motivation way back in 2015. That was the little itch that I wanted to scratch. Is it possible to build a profitable capitalist PTY Ltd style of company that helps people at the same time? And so that's when the kind of socially minded rampant capitalist comes in.
That's quite an evolution. But I think that's
it's been a hell of a journey.
Absolutely. I think that's what will create sustainability and less dependency on donors, as you rightfully pointed out. So when did you first realize that you had the gift to mobilize people around ideas?
Have you ever heard of the Gallup Strengths Finder?
Yeah.
It's an interesting
Here's my
personality
strengths,
test.
actually. I don't know if you can
there we go. Futuristic, responsibility, achiever, strategic learner. So we share achiever. That is my second strength, I think. So many, many years ago, I did one of these Gallup tests, I think just to kind of learn more about myself. And do you know what my top strength is? Take a guess.
Yes. Your top strength?
Yeah, take a guess.
Strategic?
No. Woo.
Really? Oh, I wouldn't have guessed that. My woo is in the 30s. I'm not going to...
And I think when I saw that, and why I love that Gallup Strengths exercise is that it helps not only know yourself better, but it helps put a lot of things in context and help you understand your own behavior. And so where I saw that this strength, which is very funnily named woo, which is basically the ability to charm, and which leads back to your question of motivating, that made a lot of sense. And so I don't know when it started. I don't know how it started. I always say I fell into entrepreneurship by accident and never left. But it's just always been, it's always been something I've been able to do.
Yeah. That's amazing. And I think, when did you first do the Strength Finder? Just want to figure out, when did you do it, and when did you become deliberate and intentional in pushing your strengths or your talent and making sure they turn into strengths?
Yeah, it was probably near the beginning of forgood, so about 7 years ago, I think, when I did the first one, and then redid it once or twice over the remaining years. It's fairly core to some of our culture at forgood, is understanding each other's strengths so that we can play to our strengths, not necessarily our weaknesses, which is what I like about it as a development coaching model. And that's what I said. I think I've always had woo. I mean, this is my third startup, which is painful and brings lots of stories. Yeah. But I don't think without the ability without some kind of charisma, that you can actually do this startup thing. Like, you're always having to convince people of something that they don't quite believe, whether it's from a sales perspective or a product perspective or an investment perspective. Yeah. So I think I'm just lucky. What I have in woo, I may lack in other things, like ability to understand deep accounting principles.
Yeah. That's it's actually interesting. I am a strengths finder coach. I did my strengths finder about 10 years ago. It also changed my life. It helped me understand me and not get bogged down on things that I'm not so great at, which is traditionally when we, at least in my environment, when I grew up, if you're not great at maths, it's like tutor and this and that. If we did that for a Picasso, for example, we would not have the pieces that we have today. I think it's best to actually focus on what you're great at and what you do effortlessly, because you'll be amazing as an individual. So I'm a firm believer, and it's exciting to actually see that you also follow the same path.
Absolutely. I mean, it's such a nice checkpoint within a company, especially when you're building a company or a team. That could be startup or corporate, but just to make sure that everyone's jobs are aligned to what they're good at.
Yes.
The last thing you want is a data analyst that doesn't have an analytical strength, or a salesperson that doesn't have woo or achiever, or it's just, you can often spot these complete mismatches. And the other thing I like, and we use this quite well at the beginning of For Good, is, when in any kind of beginning of a company, it's always hard to put the right teams together, and then when teams aren't working, to figure out why. And so if you take those strengths and then you just map them by color, so I think they come in those four quadrants, you can see what a team is missing.
Yes.
And so one of the big lessons we learned right in the beginning is that I think even when we had scaled to about 7 people, we had one person with executional skills, which was a real problem. And when we went through some of our toughest times, it was because we had too many thinkers and not enough doers. So too many of the learning strategic strengths and not enough of the executional strengths, or competitive style strengths. So, I mean, I wish we used it even more, but it's certainly been a very cool tool that has taught us a lot about the teams we've built over the years.
Absolutely, and understanding ourselves. So I always use this metaphor of a Sherpa. So a Sherpa is really the guide that guides you onto Everest. They don't climb for you. They coach you. They watch you. They are invested in your success as much as you are, but you've got to do it on your own. So using that, I want to come back to you and ask, who would you say has been the most important Sherpa on your journey to where you are today, to where For Good is as a successful organization?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've had my own Sherpa experience, not quite as exciting as yours. But we did this incredible trip in Vietnam to a cave called Han Song Dong. And it's kind of a 5-day hike underground. So there's a lot of safety stuff that has to happen. And there was a team of 30 Sherpas looking after 15 of us. And it was quite astonishing, the role that they played, and how much fitter they were than us. So I understand exactly where you're coming from. It's a fascinating question. I mean, a Sherpa is just a cool athletics term for a mentor, I suppose, or something similar. And it's been a weird thing about my career is that I've never actually had a traditional mentor. They've certainly been people that have been instrumental in kind of helping me throughout the ages, especially with For Good. Someone like Garth Jaffett would have been one of them, especially in those first couple of years, just trying to figure out where that balance between social development and capitalism, where that balance was. But what I've always relied on more, I think, is just the power of the network. So it's almost like mentors on demand. And I have had hundreds of mentor style conversations, but not with one mentor, with peers and teammates and investors and people on Twitter, and people at meetups when we used to do those wonderful physical events. And that it certainly wasn't intentional, but it's the way it worked out. And I suppose it's testament to the power of how powerful a network can be, and how important a network is to anyone's success.
Absolutely.
That's kind of my approach to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. And I assume that you've also played a Sherpa role for other people. I think specifically, I know that there's exciting changes that are happening in the For Good environment. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And why have you decided, to pass on the reins and to specific people, and why them?
Yeah, this has been a crazy decision. So when you've almost helped to birth an organization, and I use that with the greatest respect because I have 2 kids and I have no idea what it's like to birth anything. But I think a child and a startup have some very interesting parallels in terms of how they take over your life. And so when you've been with a company really from its inception, it's very hard to let go. I think you get good at it. For Good is such a well-oiled machine that I have a wonderful life, and I can actually spend a lot more time, coaching and mentoring my team than I have to actually doing any of the grunt work. That's a great place to be. And I think it's been 7 years now. It'll be 7 years in November, and that's a hell of a stint. And so I think it just got a bit easy as a leader and as a CEO. And so I thought it was time that I needed to do something harder. And there was also something at the back of my head which said, the problem with small businesses, so after our latest round of hiring, I think we'll be 11 or 12 people. So still a small business, but really punching above our weight in terms of what we do. But in a small business, unless someone moves aside, there's never any room for anyone to move up. Yeah. And so I think that's why in a small business, people churn. Your best employees will stick around for 2, 3, 4 years. Sure, there are outsiders. We've had someone at For Good for 8 years, more than me almost, which is incredible. But I think, so those were the motivations. It's like, it's time to do something hard while I'm still half young. It's time to make some space for other people in the team to move up. And it's time to just take on a different role. And so, yeah, that's why the decision to kind of step aside as CEO, that's where it came from. Yeah. I'm going to be remaining on the board. I said moving aside, not letting go. That's important. We've built something so magical in this company that I would always want to be involved in some form. And I remain a shareholder. But what that does do is allow some of the team to step up. So we actually announced it on the day we're recording this. But our COO, Romy Helsinger, she's stepping up to CEO. So we'll become a woman-led business, of which there are precious few in South Africa. And then as someone who started with us, almost as a junior mid-level program manager, is now moving up into the leadership team, Mashadi Twaba, and she's going to be running the biggest team in the company, the team that actually makes all the magic happen for our corporate clients. And then our CTO remains, Josh Lewis. So, new management team, female dominance, and then kind of looking back, it actually made absolute sense for this company to be run by women, because if you look at our stats, it's astonishing, and we really should talk about this more, at least publicly. But 75% of the users on For Good, 75% of the impact created by For Good is created by women. Wow. They are by far the dominant segment of volunteers and donors in South Africa, according to our data. And as far as we understand, we have more data than anyone else. So you can probably take that as a trend. And so it's very apt. It's an incredible team. It gives them a chance to stamp their own personality on this company. I can still play a role in that sort of Sherpa style, sitting on the board, coaching, mentoring, helping out where possible. But actually I can get out the way and let them do their thing. So it's a very transitory stage at the moment. It's both exciting and scary.
Absolutely. I love it. It's Women's Month, and you're letting the women lead. I always say that, somehow we lead in our homes, and we let these children go out there. And when we step out there, suddenly we're looking for permission to be leaders. I think women are phenomenal leaders, and it's exciting to see men like yourselves recognizing that. So I appreciate you for that.
Well, look, I'm not letting the women lead. This team of women richly deserves it, and likely would have kicked me out eventually.
I love
This was
that.
just manifest destiny. No, the company's in great hands, and companies need fresh, fresh energy.
Yeah.
It's an interesting thing about being a startup founder is that often startup founders don't they have cycles,
Yeah.
and sometimes knowing when to get out of the way.
Yes.
Garth certainly knew that. He originated this idea. One of his other big successes was Soul City. I mean, that was an enormous success. And even then, he knew when to kind of get out of the way and let that fly. And so I just took a lesson out of his books and got out the way.
That is definitely true leadership. Andy, with that, I just want to give our sponsors an opportunity to give a shout out and let everybody know what they do because they make this podcast possible.
Because It's There with Saray Khumalo is proudly sponsored by Vuma.
Let's move on to contextualizing Andy's world, right? I don't know if you know this, but I know that you founded Get a Life at the age of 19, around 1997, when startup ventures were not sexy and glamorous yet. So looking back, what advice would you give your younger self about starting up a business from scratch and seeing it for the long haul?
Oh wow! Okay, so you're digging up some really interesting past scars and past journeys. So like small correction, co-founded. It's been an interesting part of my life is that 2 out of the 3 startups I've done, I've more been a co-founder than a founder. So I've taken someone else's idea and kind of run with it. And so this Get a Life was originally the baby of a guy called John Kuhn, who back in, it's more like 99, I think. So he was a very, very well-known student at Wits, Rhodes Scholar, like real out the park kind of guy. And he came up with this idea. This was pre-Facebook. And he came up with this idea of a student portal to help not only connect students, but also provide content for students and services. And I mean, this company was incredible. At a stage, we had a dating site called a Girl Squeezer. We had dial-up internet, because this is how far back it was. I said pre-Facebook. We had email addresses. We had classifieds. We had, an activations business for on-campus promotions. It was really this incredible little business. So looking back, I ended up running that for about 5 or 6 years as John went to his Rhodes Scholarship. And then interestingly enough, a lot of people that weren't involved. So John died at the age of 25. It was very, very shocking and very sudden. He had a heart condition that no one really knew about. So that's why I said you're digging up interesting parts of the journey. And so looking back, there were a lot of mistakes I made and a lot of things that caused unnecessary tension and pain and impeded the progress of that business, which eventually had to shut down. Number one, do your legal stuff right. Probably the biggest lesson I learned from when I think he died when I was 23 or 22, and I managed to keep it alive for another year and a half or so. But because we hadn't done the legal stuff right, because we didn't have shareholders agreements in place and share subscriptions and share certificates and partnership agreements and any of that, the first thing that happened was we had investors. There were very prominent people that were involved. John Madison, he's a famous journalist. Gareth Cliff was involved. This was a big deal back then. We were just too young and naive to really turn it into something magical. But when he died, the whole company just got sucked into his estate, and almost stopped operating immediately. And we had to find interesting ways to kind of get around that. So, long story short, biggest lesson is do your legals. And ever since then, I have been absolutely pedantic about developing relationships with great lawyers and then making sure governance, compliance, legal is absolutely airtight, so that a big dream and a beautiful company like that doesn't have to die because of a preventable mistake. So I know that's very heavy and compliancy, but it's an important lesson and one that certainly affected the rest of my career.
Absolutely. So co-founded, I didn't realize that. Get a Life was dubbed a political mouthpiece for students, and even experienced the disdain of the mighty Robert Mugabe at some point. Um, was that in itself a reward, given that the brand lived up to the values of activism?
Yeah, I mean, this was John Kuhn's genius. So I've always kind of been the product guy. So I could make it look good. I could make people use it. I could invent revenue streams and monetize products. But John was very much kind of the political genius there, and a lot of that. A lot of that came about from these little games we used to release, and where we got sued. It was a bit melodramatic, but we got a legal letter, from what I remember, from the Zimbabwean government, is that we came up with this game. There was called Squirt Diesel at Robert Mugabe. Now remember, we were like 20-year-old students, so this is all very very dramatic and off center. And so his face would hop around the screen, and you would click on him and squirt diesel at him until he exploded. And it was linked to some big diesel scandal, I think, that happened. More, and we had 20 of these games. More locally relevant ones were Tony Leon and Thabo Mbeki in a boxing match, because the DA, remember the DA came with their Fight Back campaign, and so we called it Fight Black, and it was like absolutely like cutting edge satire. And my favorite one, which we actually released, I think after his death, was remember when parliamentarians were allowed to cross the floor for the first time? So they were allowed to change political parties. So we had this game where there were a whole bunch of cartoon parliamentarians running across the floor, just jumping from party to party, because everyone just jumped ship at that stage. And you shot fireballs at them and exploded them. And every time you exploded a politician, you would save a piece of the Constitution, and you would win if you saved the whole Constitution. So it was little things like that. And I think, it was just a great example of how to differentiate and how to be locally relevant. And how sometimes being a bit edgy is good. It's similar things with forgood. Being proudly capitalist in the development space is not normal. Talking about profitability and things like that is often frowned upon by. There's so many people in need. How dare you, talk about issuing dividends? And I say no. Being edgy, being different, zig when they zag, all of that good stuff is important. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Yeah,
it's certainly a fun story.
It definitely did, but it also says it doesn't have to be serious and business all the time. It can be fun because life is too short, really. And I see that with that background, there is no way you couldn't have come up with something as amazing as forgood.
Well, at least monetized it, made it work. Again, forgood was the genius of Garth. Yeah. He had this original vision of how can you move the needle on inequality. One of the ways is if you take the resources of the haves and you match it to the needs of the have-nots. Yes. And that was kind of his social development vision. And what he lacked was just the ability to turn that into a technology product. And that's why the partnership actually worked so well and lasted 7 years and will last long after that. We remain friends and both remain on the board of forgood. Is that, in the tech world, they call it the hustler hacker combo. So someone's got to be a hustler and someone's got to be a hacker. Someone's got to be business and someone's got to be code and tech. And I think having those complementary skills is really, really important in building anything, wherever you are.
Absolutely. So, Andy, in your illustrious career, you've sunk your teeth in some of the notable projects at F&B. I worked with you at Discovery, one being on corporate crowdfunding, the bank's first official Facebook presence, I believe. Would you say the incentive to connect and rally communities on social media has changed in a good or bad way since then?
Wow, that is a cracker question. I have some very strong views on social media. And I think I think we're all entitled to have strong views because social media is in its infancy, really. I mean, it's what, 15 years old, maybe less, 12, 15 years old. I mean, Facebook only really mainstreamed in South Africa in 2010. So it's really a baby technology. And as with many baby technologies, we haven't quite figured out how to use it. And we haven't figured out how to manage the unintended consequences of social media. So it's interesting you say that, because community building and especially leveraging things like social media has definitely been a theme throughout my career. And I've always been sort of one of the early adopters of these kind of platforms. And I think the only way to deal with social media at the moment from an intellectual point of view is to realize that it's very much a yin and yang. There are incredible pros and devastatingly evil cons. On the pro side, it has never been easier to form a community around an interest, whatever that interest might be, and connect and make things happen. The power of social media to overthrow governments and repeal abusive laws and force behavioral change, and at the same time organize your local climbing group. It does all of that literally by design, effortlessly. What is life without your neighborhood Facebook group?
Never mind the WhatsApp.
Oh, yeah, I stay for all of them. And then, of course, the other side is that it's become this channel for disinformation and alternative facts and anonymous bullying and race baiting and just everything that's wrong with the world has suddenly been amplified by these channels that we just don't quite understand. And I don't think there's an easy solution to it. I think this is a problem that humanity is just going to have to deal with, because by our very nature, humans are community-oriented creatures. Sure. So whether we had social media or not, we were always forming communities. Now the communities are just being formed in front of everyone with a big megaphone and Google, so that anyone can look up anything you've ever done on a community at any time. Yeah. So it's certainly lots of pause for thought and something we as humans need to get a bit better at managing.
Absolutely. So the common thread in your narrative is that you're a social entrepreneur at heart, it seems, right? At
least in the last 7 years. Probably not before that.
Absolutely. I mean, if I look at For Good, it's just amazing. It's a testament of how social entrepreneurship can work, Any pointers by yourself on how South Africa can engineer a thriving culture of entrepreneurship, given its young population, which, by the way, is disillusioned by the millions?
Yeah, no, I totally get that. I mean, there's a couple of questions in there. So why is social entrepreneurship important? And I think it's critically important. And I think it's even more important to almost not differentiate between social entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship. We have this saying at forgood, it became kind of one of our mantras, is that we wanted to be able to return social and capital dividends in equal measures, okay? Knowing that that's basically impossible. But that the tension of trying to make those decisions where you would never sacrifice capital returns for social impact, but you would also never sacrifice social impact for capital returns. That tension should lead to something magical, which I think it is. Look, forgood's not going to list on the JSE anytime soon, but it certainly has a really, really good growth trajectory now, and it could turn into a stellar medium-sized business. So I think South Africans need to start building businesses that make money and help people at the same time. If that's what you want to call social entrepreneurship, so be it. But there are plenty of problems to solve and boring problems. Like, stop trying to chase Silicon Valley. Like, what Africa needs now are boring companies solving boring problems that can make tons of money and affect tons of lives. Think construction and infrastructure and solving social problems, education, There are just so many problems. It's why our continent has so much opportunity at the moment. And then, I mean, how to inspire the youth beyond the obvious, which is there is still an enormous amount of red tape around being an entrepreneur. And a lot of it, and this is probably controversial, but I think it needs to be talked about. A lot of it is in our very draconian, overprotective labor law system. Now, I absolutely understand why that labor law system is in place, because we are dominated by very large corporate companies. And those companies, if not given fairly strict regulations, will abuse lower income workers. And I say abuse with, with respect. But that's why our labor laws exist. But for an entrepreneur, I'm too scared to hire a young person, because if I get it wrong, it's going to take me 6 months to get rid of them. They're going to take me to the CCMA. That's going to eat another month of my time. And the risk of hiring the wrong person almost outweighs the benefit of hiring the right person. And that's terribly sad. And I shouldn't think like that, because companies are only built with the right people. But I think there's got to be a way to relax some of that regulation and some of those stringent rules around hiring, so that we can get the youth into our companies. And if they make it, they make it. If they don't, they don't. They churn out, they find another opportunity. But I think there's a lot of South African small businesses that are just scared to hire. And all that does is it turns them into lifestyle businesses. They reach a certain size where it's providing them with a great lifestyle, and there's just no incentive to get bigger. One more cool story. There's an incredible organization that I know called the African Leadership Academy, and they have this entrepreneurial competition called the Anzisha Prize, which is very well worth your audience having a look at. And they've come up with this fascinating theory, and it triggered because you asked about the youth. They said, I think it's by I'll get the date slightly wrong, but by 2035, there's going to be 1 billion youth on the African continent. Okay. And what they've found through years and years of research and engaging with youth is that the only people that will hire young people are other young people. Okay. Because old people are too scared to. They make excuses. There's generational gaps. I can't handle millennials. I can't handle Gen Zs, whatever it might be. But young people have got no problem hiring other young people. So the way to truly transform this continent, and this is African Leadership Academy's thesis, is to support very young entrepreneurs. So entrepreneurs from the age of 15 up to 22, like get them started then, because those are the only people that are really going to be able to make use of the biggest differentiator Africa has, which is a 1 billion strong workforce in the next decade. Absolutely. Anyway, two interesting stories. Hopefully answers your question.
Yeah, it does. So one last thing that is directly connected to For Good, volunteerism. What does it mean to you, and why is it so important for the continent?
Sure. I mean, I have learned some very hard lessons about volunteerism. And again, I mean, there's a lot of stories behind here. So the volunteering culture in South Africa was a lot less developed than we thought it was. It still isn't very developed. And we formed a theory about why. And perhaps your audience would find this interesting. So we think, at least the team at For Good thinks, that there's a lot of stuff competing for South Africans giving attention. Okay, so if you've got this much giving that you can give, and this much time that you can spend on giving, think about what's competing for it. So you've got extended family giving, so black tax. Okay? Yeah. I know nothing about black tax, but it's a real thing. Some of the work you and I did at Discovery was my first exposure to how powerful and how overwhelming something like black tax can be. So that's competing for your giving attention. Okay, tithing, so faith-based giving, is competing for your giving attention. Traffic light giving. You have this opportunity in South Africa to give at every single traffic light, at every single petrol station. What we call socioeconomic ladder giving. So if you're privileged enough to have someone who helps you around the house, they are often your first channel of giving. So you've got a spare laptop, it's going to go to your domestic helper. It's going to go to the person who helps you with your garden. And so you've got all of these things, and then even Stokvels, so like extended community giving and community support. All of these things are competing for South Africans giving attention. And so there's just not a lot left for volunteering. And it's changing, it's growing. And I think it's going to largely grow because of the weight that corporate South Africa is now putting behind it in terms of supporting and giving employees time and structure and capacity to do employee volunteering. But it certainly wasn't what we thought it was. Why is it important? I mean, it's fascinating. The For Good was founded because there's a real business gap in Africa. If you go to the US, UK, Canada, employee volunteering is mainstream. Okay? It's the done thing. Most companies have mature volunteering programs. People get anywhere between 2 and 5 days leave. The Microsoft global volunteering program has 70,000 participants in it. Yeah. They have something like a 70% participation rate in employee volunteering. There's not a single South African company that comes close to that. So why is it mainstream in the developed world and non-existent in Africa? That was the business gap that we went for. Turns out it's a small market, but it's only small for now. It's growing. The companies that do what we do in America are enormous. They're billion-dollar companies. And why is it mainstream in the developed world? Well, because volunteering has some pretty powerful outcomes. So personally, it has health outcomes. So there's plenty of research out there that shows that volunteering makes you healthier and happier and reduces stress levels. There are actual documented health outcomes for volunteering when you're in the 60-plus age segment. You live longer. I can point you towards the research. It's fascinating. And then from a corporate point of view, or at least from an employer point of view, volunteers are more productive. Volunteering programs improve morale. They improve brand affinity. They improve this airy-fairy thing we like to talk about, which is purpose-driven business. Like, it allows people to develop something meaningful alongside their job, purpose alongside profit, which is a philosophy largely being driven by the younger generations, who are now looking at employers going, well, if you don't have a volunteering program, I might not consider working with you. That's why volunteering is important. All of those fascinating outcomes on both sides of the table.
Absolutely. So, Andy, it's been amazing. My last question, describe your best challenge or your best failure and how it's propelled you forward.
Sure. Best failure. I like the way you phrase that. There's a Seth Godin quote that I like. He says, "If I fail more than you, I win," which I like because I think it speaks to also the iterative nature of failing and learning and trying again. Yeah. Look, the failure I became most well known for through my own volition was Real Time Wine, which was my second startup, which was a wine review, a consumer wine review app, and again a community around wine drinkers, which we then expanded into the beer market. And again, it suffered from just being in too small a market, but it didn't stop an incredible community building up, and it was an amazing product, and it had a lot of really, really engaged and happy users. And I think they generated something like 65,000 data points on wine and beer, which has never been done before, as far as I understand. And the startup failed because it didn't make enough money, and it wasn't global enough. And the smartphone owning wine drinking audience in South Africa in 2014 was just too small. 2014 was kind of the death of BlackBerry, if you remember. So, yes. Story of my life, timing always wrong. And then so when I decided to close that down, I did something which was fairly unusual at the time, which is I wrote about it. And I wrote extensively about why it failed and the mistakes I made and the things I wouldn't do again. And it turned into this epistle. If your audience wants to Google My Street MBA and my name, you'll find it. It's on andyhadfield.com. And that just didn't happen in the South African startup environment. Failure was very stigmatized. You just disappeared. You went away. You said sorry to your investors, and you hid away for a year and then came back and tried again. And I just didn't like that, because it's one of the problems with social media is you're only seeing the good stories then. You're not seeing the real stories. 95% of startups fail, if not more. But we only hear about the 5% that succeed, which makes you think everyone succeeds, which is not true. It's the same as, everyone's fancy pictures at the beach. Not everyone's at the beach on Facebook. Some people are sitting at home, crying into their glass of wine. And I think that this little article, like mini thesis, it got quite popular, and it started getting used as content at entrepreneurial accelerators. And I spent almost a year being the poster boy for startup failure, doing the conference tour and speaking all over the place, which is terribly demeaning, like in hindsight. But I think it was necessary. And I think those kind of failures help build grit and resilience, which is possibly the only skill you need to survive in the modern world.
Yeah, I love that. I believe that failure is only a failure if we don't learn from it. If you learn from it, it propels you forward almost always.
Exactly.
Fantastic. Andy, it's been amazing. I don't know if you have any last words for, the listeners that you would like to leave just out there in terms of your philosophy and what you got out of this conversation. I know I took you back to some of the conversations you had a few years ago. Anything that you want to leave out there?
No, that was a wonderful trip down memory lane. And yeah, I mean, no real parting words. I think we've said so much. Yeah. It's kind of just don't be scared. Just do it. Hustle hard. Life isn't easy. Don't expect anything to be handed to you on a plate. Just you got to work for it. Be gritty. Be resilient, and you'll be fine.
Absolutely. That was Andy Hadfield, the co-founder, not the founder, co-founder of For Good Foundation, an amazing, amazing person, a gift to South Africa, and one that is looking at entrepreneurship differently, because we can actually make money and make a difference and leave our world much better. Thank you, Andy.